Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Leslie presents. And now your host, Paul Leslie.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome our special guest, saxophonist Aaron Heick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
So who is Aaron Heick?
Who is Aaron Heick? Well, I am a saxophone player, woodwind doubler. I live in New York City. Grew up originally in Seattle on the West Coast, but I moved out to New York quite a while ago in the mid-'80s, basically, and just been here since then, basically working as a musician, trying to do everything I can out here and play with many people as I can and do some of my own stuff as well.
I think most stories are best from the beginning. What was life like growing up?
I had a good life. I have a great family. Both my mom and my dad are musicians as well, and I think that's what definitely sparked the interest. My dad played saxophone as well. He actually still does. I remember as a kid, I'd follow him around to rehearsals and gigs, and that was like the coolest thing ever. There was basically nothing cooler than that. I just loved being around that world, and obviously I love the music too. And between both my mom and my dad, I got exposed to a lot of great music. All kinds of stuff. My mom was more of a classical musician, plays violin and viola, and my dad, being a saxophone player, was, more into jazz and pop music and things like that, but also classical music as well. So I got great taste of what was out there, from a pretty early age.
So you said your father was also a saxophone player, or is a saxophone player.
Well, his name is Heick. He still lives in Seattle, and music was sort of his second income. He was a teacher, actually, not a music teacher. He taught philosophy at a local college for many years, but always was out gigging and playing, and just kind of did everything there was to do sort of in the local Seattle scene as far as like a commercial musician could do. Everything from playing shows to weddings to the circus when I came to town, things like that. A lot of those things were things I got to go tag along to and see, so it gave me a great insight into just kind of what the world of being a professional musician was like.
Was there a moment when you realized that the saxophone was it for you?
Not really. There was actually, but it was sort of an accident. I can't say it reached out and grabbed me. It wasn't my first choice, actually. When I was a little kid, I really wanted to be a drummer. I grew up with the Beatles, and so of course Ringo Starr being the drummer for the Beatles, that was as a little kid who I looked to as like, wow, I want to be him. I wanted to be that. But of course, my parents, I think, were smart enough to not let their 10-year-old kid have a drum set in the house. So when it came time to actually pick an instrument to join the band in grade school in 5th grade, through just circumstances, I ended up picking the saxophone kind of because all the other boys wanted to play drums and trumpet and things like that. So some of us had to play some other instruments. So for some reason, I was talked into the saxophone, and I think I figured because my dad played it that maybe I would get some tips there. So it was kind of a spontaneous choice, but it actually worked out great. I'm very happy with the way it worked out, actually.
Our special guest is Aaron Heick. You currently make your home in the New York City area. What attracted you to New York?
Well, that was pretty easy. Even from a pretty early age, I just would look at all the records that I really loved. It was either New York or L.A., if you're talking American records, and, especially all the great jazz recordings that I really loved. It just seems like everything was done in New York, so it seems like that was the obvious choice. There's just such a huge range of types of music and types of musicians and just the art world in general, even beyond music, that exists here. That way it just seemed like there was no other place I really wanted to be.
How did you meet Chaka Khan?
Actually, that was through a mutual friend who was producing some tracks from her. This was back in the early 90s. He had wanted to bring me in to play on a tune. I think it was the album. Can't think of the name off the top. Not I'm Every Woman. It was a name like that. I can't think of it right off the top of my head. But he wanted her to hear me so he could bring me into the studio to play on a track. And so he actually brought her down to a club I was playing at. It was a great band, and it was a lot of fun. So they came by, and she seemed to like the way I played, and so the rest is history. That ended up turning into basically about 8 years of work with me on the road. So that was a lot of fun.
Are there any memorable moments of the recordings you made with her?
Well, I only did a couple recordings. With her, my time with her was more live stuff, on the road, and there were a lot of memorable experiences with that. One that just jumps right into my mind is I remember the first time Stevie Wonder ever jumped on stage with us. because people forget she and Stevie go way back. He wrote her first big hit for her, from one of her the early Rufus record, Tell Me Something Good. So they're good friends, and so he used to show up on the gig a lot, and he'd always end up just jumping on stage and sitting in with us. And I remember the first time that happened, it was at the Greek Theater in Los Angeles, and I've always been a big Stevie fan, and I just remember my heart going to my chest. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe I was actually on the same stage with both of them, actually, and he sounded great. And that was just amazing. But there was a lot of great experiences like that with her. And she's just such a fantastic singer. I mean, Bill, I can't think of anybody who sings as well as her. She's so great.
Our special guest is saxophonist Aaron Heick here on the Paul Leslie Hour. What was it like playing on Richard Banas records and playing with him?
Well, that was also a great experience. I mean, Richard, I don't know how many people know about him. He's not as well known in America. He's pretty well known in Europe, especially in jazz circles. A lot of musicians know him here, but he is just an absolutely fantastic musician. Just honestly one of the heaviest musicians I've ever encountered. He's both as a bass player, as a singer, as a writer. He's also a great guitar player, percussionist. He really does a lot. But yeah, the studio things were always fun. I mean, that was one thing, and then his live presentation of his material was always very different, and both were fun, but I spent a lot of time on the road with him as well. Traveled all over the world. I mean, we went to some pretty crazy places. Got to go to, a lot of places in Africa with him, and his talent is so staggering. It's just kind of, you'd never know what to expect, and he would always do something that would just, even when you thought you'd heard all his tricks, he would pull something else out that you just sit there with your jaw on the floor going, wow.
Who do you consider some of the great sax players from yesteryear?
Oh, wow. Well, there's a lot. I mean, there's so many you can point to. I mean, some of my favorites, people I've always loved. I mean, I grew up, Charlie Parker was obviously one of the first, people I became really aware of. John Coltrane, people like that, Sonny Rollins. Wayne Shorter, has become one of my favorites over the years. I mean, I just think Wayne is a true genius. Just, there's so much inspiration there in everything he plays. Just sort of so unpredictable and quirky, but inspired always. But older players, I mean, Johnny Hodges is another one who I really loved, just as far as alto players go. I mean, it was so soulful and so sweet and such a beautiful player. But there's a lot. We could probably talk about this all day, and we could keep drawing names out of the hat.
What about the sax players from today? Is there any of the younger sax players that have caught your eye?
There are a lot of really great saxophone players out there. Guys like Chris Potter, Donnie McCaslin, Joel Fromm, Dave Binney. I mean, I could go on and on. There's some players that are probably lesser known. They're more like musicians, guys I know here in New York, guys like Andy Snitzer, Dave Mann. I could go on, and I really feel bad because I know I'll leave some people out, and I hope nobody gets mad at me for that. But there are a lot of really great players just here in the city and then around the world. I'm always sort of surprised. You just encounter really great young players all over the place. There's been a big explosion of just jazz education in the last generation, and so you go to Europe and they're crawling out of the woodwork, especially tenor players, just really good players. They're everywhere now.
You've performed and you've been on the records of a lot of people. You mentioned earlier performing with Stevie Wonder, but then there have been artists that you've played with: Billy Joel, Sting, Paul Simon, Benny King, Barry Manilow, Aretha Franklin, Dionne Warwick. I could go on and on.
Sure.
Has there been an artist, if you could do it again, that you would most want to play with again?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of those people, pretty much everybody you mentioned, I mean, these were all great experiences, and I'd be happy to play with any of them again. I mean, the thing about working with artists on that level is when you're talking about the really great artists out there, I mean, they're there for a reason. It's because they really are great. And so, consequently, playing with them is always a satisfying experience. And yeah, I mean, it would always be unfair to point out anyone in particular. I mean, one person I've worked with sort of more recently, though, that I really have enjoyed working with is Sting. I got to do a bunch of stuff with him in the last couple of years, and he's just so great. He's just such a fantastic, singer, player, writer, everything. And he's a great guy, too. He's really fun to just be around. And there's other artists who are no longer with us who I wish I could work with again. I got to work with Frank Sinatra once when I was pretty young, and that was really an amazing experience. And so, sometimes I think about people like that more, some of the artists who aren't with us anymore.
Well, that one begs the question. What was it like performing alongside the late, great Frank Sinatra?
For me, it was quite a eye-opening experience because, again, I was pretty young when I did it. I was probably around 20 years old, something like that. And it was in Boston. I was working with the Herb Pomeroy Orchestra, actually, got invited to do this gig with Frank, and had a couple other people on the bill too. But I was young, and honestly, at the time, I wasn't that familiar with sort of the hipper side of Frank's stuff. I mean, I was aware of him, obviously, but I knew some of the, other things later in life that maybe I didn't think were that as cool or great. But I didn't know about like all the Capitol Years stuff and really, really, really great stuff he had done. And so it was one of those things, I think maybe my expectations just weren't that high. But this is happening with a handful of performers over the years, where the second they walk on the stage, there's just an electricity that goes through the room. It's very tangible. You really feel it. And I just remember very clearly that moment, sitting on the stage at Symphony Hall in Boston. He walked on the stage, and even before he opened his mouth, it was like, okay, I get it. You just really felt it. There was something special about this guy, and then he sang great, and it was just, these arrangements were incredible. It was an amazing night for me.
The title of your record is Daylight and Darkness. What is the significance of the title?
It's basically just talking about life, and on many levels. I mean, you go through your ups and downs. A day starts out light, and you go into darkness at nighttime. It's, a lot of metaphors and analogies there. But it's just basically talking about life and how it's kind of cyclical and starts out one place and goes to another place and then sort of starts over again, and it's always evolving.
There's a song on the album, and its title is Desert Lullaby. What was the inspiration behind that song?
It was a melody I came up with. I mean, honestly, that was really the main inspiration. It was just I came up with the melody, and then the backdrop I set it to, I wanted sort of a Latin-esque feel to it, and I got a good friend of mine, Samuel Torres, who's a fantastic percussionist, to play on it, and we sort of just created this very kind of sort of thoughtful, mellow, almost like bolero kind of groove for it. And the title, I can't say really has anything specifically to do with the inspiration, other than that was just sort of what came to me after I wrote it and we put together the whole thing. But really the inspiration was it was the melody that I'd come up with there.
There's another song on Daylight and Darkness. We're talking to the composer, Aaron Heick. What inspired the melody on Drifting Upstream?
Well, it's a little bit of a musical joke, actually, because there's a point in the middle of the song where there's this line that sort of goes back and forth between a couple notes, and the melody keeps rising in pitch and starts getting faster and faster. I mean, it's always going up. The harmony, though, is going the opposite direction. It's actually sort of moving down, and so you have these two elements moving in opposite directions. And so obviously the term drifting upstream is a bit of a play on words, because if you've ever been in a stream, you know that water drifts downstream. You can't drift upstream. It's physically impossible. So it's just sort of a play on words, but it came from that idea of the melody moving one direction, the harmony moving in another direction.
How do you typically come up with a melody?
Usually at a piano. I'll just sort of tinker around on a keyboard for a while until I stumble on something that I kind of like, and then I'll just try to develop it there, and then maybe I'll start to play it on a horn and see where that takes me, on a saxophone or a flute or something, and then that usually sort of inspires another direction for it. There's really no set pattern. I mean, all of these tunes come from different places, and whatever you stumble upon is what you end up developing, and hopefully that becomes a song, and hopefully it becomes a good song.
Our special guest is Aaron Heick. You're also a member of the CBS Orchestra on The Late Show with David Letterman. How did you become a member of the band?
Well, that just happened fairly recently, just basically this past spring. Well, I know that the saxophone player who was doing it, Bruce Kapler, was leaving, and so they started basically inviting a bunch of other sax players to come in and play, essentially as auditions, but, it was everybody would get a few shows or a period of time play, and I think it was just a process of just see who felt comfortable, or I should say who Paul felt comfortable with. And I mean, I knew some of the other people in the band pretty well, and so I think I was recommended by them, and that's how that came about. And for whatever reason, it just worked out that Paul was comfortable with me, and I've been there since. So.
What is taping an episode of The Late Show? From your perspective as a musician, what is the experience like?
Well, it's pretty crazy, I got to tell you. I mean, it's a fun gig. It's great, but it can be a little nerve-wracking. There's a lot of pressure. I mean, one of the fun things about the show is it's very spontaneous, just the way they do everything. You never quite know what's going to happen. It's not that scripted. I mean, obviously some of the stuff is that Dave does, but, there's a lot of room they just go wherever it goes, and it's the same with the music. You just never quite know what's going to happen, and it's really fly by the seat of your pants, so you really got to pay attention, and Paul just calls tunes kind of last second, and you just gotta just jump on as quick as you can. It's hard and it's a challenge, but at the same time, it's a lot of fun, and the band is great, and it's just so much fun playing with those guys. You know.
Is there anything coming up in the near future with you or your music?
Well, unfortunately, nothing with my own project. I mean, I guess I've been a bit of a victim of my own success in a way. That I'm very busy right now between Letterman and a couple other gigs I'm doing regularly that I just haven't really had the time to work on any of my own stuff again. But I'm hoping to get back to that soon. Hoping just things will settle down with my schedule enough that I can actually start doing some more writing and producing some more stuff. Having said that, I can't complain. I mean, I have a very full plate right now, but it's all great stuff, and I'm really happy to be doing all the playing I'm doing.
What is the best thing about being Aaron Heick?
Well, honestly, I think it's this career that I've managed to stumble upon. It's, you know, I love what I do. I love playing music, and I've been very fortunate in that I've been able to play with so many great people, so many great musicians. And there's a lot of variety in what I do, and I get to play with a lot of different people. And, you know, every day is a new adventure, and that's always very exciting. And I don't take it for granted. I feel very fortunate to be in that position.
My last question is very open-ended. For anyone who's listening in, what do you want to say to all the people who are listening?
What do I want to say to everybody? I guess what I would say is, I'm assuming if people are listening, it's because they have a love of music, and I think that's a great thing. And keep listening and keep an open mind. Try to listen to new things all the time. Always explore. Try to find who's new out there doing new and interesting things. I think that gets a little harder the way the music industry is set up these days. The mainstream music industry really kind of narrowed down options. So a lot of times, sort of more creative things don't get the attention or the light that they should, and so you kind of have to seek them out, which, unfortunately, with the internet and things like that, you can find almost anything. Yeah, you do have to be a little adventurous and go looking for things and follow up leads, and there's a lot of great music out there that's, you know, not getting maybe the attention it could or should, and I would just encourage people to keep listening and looking for new stuff and find the stuff that floats your boat.
Our special guest has been Aaron Heick. Thank you very much for making the time to do this interview. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. My pleasure.
I also wanted to turn everybody on to the website, and in case they're wondering how to spell Heick, it's www.aaronheick, and that's HEICK.com. I spelled it right, didn't I?
Yes, you did, and Aaron with 2 A's, too. Don't forget that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Aaron.
Thank you, Paul.
It's a pleasure.